Welcome, and we are so grateful to have you here with us today, Dr. Whitman. And for those of you who are joining us, I wanted to let you know, please put your questions and comments in the chat. Ms. Salas will be monitoring those, and we're also going to be putting some resources for you in the chat as the presentation's going along. So thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Whitman.
Yes, thank you, Kizzy, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for spending your lunch with me. I'm going to jump right in. I have a lot to cover and not so much time. So can everyone see this? Kizzy, can you see this? You're the first one on my screen. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. As Dr. Lopez said, I'm an assistant professor at UNLV in the Department of Ed Psych, Leadership, and Higher Education. I'm also the faculty advisor of the Fostering Scholars Program at UNLV. It's a program that supports young people who experience foster care at the campus. Similar work I was doing at UCR, just more like in a advisory role. I'm also a faculty affiliate at UCLA. I still work with the Pritzker Center for Strengthening Children and Families, and also with the UCLA Center for the Transformation of Schools. Still continuing to do research that was built off of my postdoc when I was at UCLA for about a year. I've only been at UNLV for about 7 months. I started July 1, so I'm still relatively new to academia, and my heart is always with the young people and with the students that we're supposed to be serving. And so my presentation is entitled Navigating, Resisting, and Subverting Hegemony and Carceral Violence, Understanding the College-Going Experiences of Black Foster Youth. And so we have a lot to cover. First, I'm going to talk about my personal background and approach, the history and context of foster care. We will unpack carcerality and its impact on Black foster youth, the intersections of race and foster care status in higher education, and then we'll discuss family privilege and the ways in which Black foster youth subvert it, and then last but not least, community as resistance to carcerality and hegemony. And so first, my personal background and an approach. As Dr. Lopez said, I am a two-time Fresno State alum. The woman on the left-hand side is my foster mom, whom I call affectionately my grandmother. That was us, I believe, right before a Boise State game. And then the woman on my right-hand side of the photo, we could call her my foster cousin. Her name is Janae Swain. She too also was in care. She is now the executive director of California Youth Connection and is also a MSW. And so I spent nearly my entire childhood in foster care, ages from 0 to 2, and then again from 6 to 18 years old. When I emancipated, there was no AB 12. So when I went to Fresno State as a freshman, I was relatively on my own. It was also during another economic downturn. And so the Chafee grant wasn't even available to me my first year at Fresno State. Very rare that I spent 11 years in the same foster home. For those of us who know about the lack of permanence and housing stability that accompanies young people who are in foster care, I was very fortunate and just outright lucky that I was in her home for 11 years. And what this provided me is my ability to go to the same middle school and then go to that feeder high school with all of my peers, and my education was not interrupted, and what allowed me to take all of my A through G requirements, take my SATs, and be able to even have a fighting chance to go to college. Also, my foster mom being Black allowed me to be exposed to Black culture. It also allowed me in school to pass as someone who was not in foster care. I could tell my peers, I just live with my grandma, which many young Black people do, right? And so as we know that within schools, kids could be mean, and also administrators and teachers could also hold their own bias when it comes to students' family makeup. So I wasn't forced to be outed like I was in the previous foster homes where those parents were not Black. And so I worked at Fresno State for a number of years in various capacities. In my master's program there, I worked with the Renaissance Scholars Program alongside Dr. Lopez as a GA. It was probably the seed that kind of got planted in me that then started to pursue this work. I then started my PhD program at the University of San Diego. There, I worked with the Assistant Vice President, Dr. Cynthia Avery, and we worked together to establish a foster youth program at that campus as well. And then after about 3 years on that campus, I decided to take a leave of absence because that PhD program was not it for me. We'll just be brief in saying that. And then I took a job at UC Riverside, where I became the first director of their Guardian Scholars Program, where I eventually then transferred my doctoral coursework there and then graduated with my PhD there in 2021. And so these are my former students at UCR, where I was there for a little over 6 years. They are phenomenal. Many of them now are MSWs. In this picture, there's a doctor. There is someone who is an L2 in law school, someone who is the director of Riverside County Homeless Youth Services Division. So young people really doing amazing things and certainly giving back. And so my theoretical approach, the way in which I approach my research now as a faculty member is community engaged, meaning my research is very much engaged with the young people that I study. But also from a theoretical lens, I use critical race theory. Critical race theory is not this boogeyman in the closet. As we probably have seen in the news over the past couple of years, there's this assumption that it's being taught in elementary school or even high school. It's not. It's barely taught in grad school. It's barely taught in PhD programs. It's mostly taught in law schools. If it is even taught in law schools, it's taught in law schools. It is a very dense framework. Depending on who you ask, we might say different things. However, there are some central tenets, as we say, that guide CRT as a framework. So the first one is race is socially constructed, right? Race and racism is central to understanding US policies and practices. CRT also challenges dominant ideology, such as colorblind thinking and meritocracy. It also centers the experiential knowledge of people to combat hegemonic narratives. And also it understands racial realism. Simply put, how whiteness reestablishes itself in the face of challenges and mutates to preserve the status quo. And last but not least, another major CRT tenet coined by Kimberly Crenshaw is intersectionality, how racial identity intersects with other disenfranchised identities and forms marginalization that influence lived experience. And the interesting thing about understanding the intersections of our identities, intersectionality as a theory is not just putting together every single identity that you hold and seeing what emerges. It is how racial identities intersect with other disenfranchised identities, right? So it's really important to kind of locate that. And then now we're going to talk about the history and context. So first, what is foster care? I'm not assuming that everyone on this call understands this institution that is foster care, but it's going to be rather brief. But simply put, foster care is a system with the purpose of supporting dependent, neglected, and abused children who need to be temporarily removed from their biological families, in which the state intervene in family life to protect the children involved. It's also important to understand that foster care is incredibly bureaucratic, which makes it difficult for families to navigate it. There's also different types of foster care placements. You could be placed in a non-relative placement, which that is the type of placements I was in. You could be placed in kin gap or kin care, which are placed with someone who is related to you. And also you could be placed in a group home as well. So those are kind of like the main types of foster care placements. And then who is in foster care? African Americans, Black children are disproportionately represented in the child welfare system. When compared to the white counterparts, Black children are 44% more likely to being placed in foster care. Dorothy Roberts, a legal scholar at UPenn, describes foster care as a racist institution. CPS in some cities is used to police Black families, to criminalize their parents, and force re-entry into their children into foster care. And so it's important to not describe and kind of name foster care as this neutral institution, especially when we understand the ways in which it marginalizes Black children and families. And so here is kind of the percentages of across racial groups of who is in foster care. And so you'll see that while Black children make up 14% of the US population, they make up 23% of the foster care population. And then so the history of foster care, how do we get here? People write entire books about this, and I only have a couple of bullet points. But in the early 1900s, America began to formalize foster care as a system. A system was created to provide welfare benefits where they provided in-home services to white mothers who were struggling to take care of their children. During the mid-1960s, as Black people began to gain rights, they were able to access those same welfare benefits that were specifically for and entitled to white women. However, due to this racist hysteria of the Black welfare queen, state and federal agencies shifted from in-home services and created out-of-home services, which is what we know as foster care. So basically what happened was the government and certain agencies did not want to hand over basically money, hand over fist to support Black women. So instead, they designed a system where it was like, well, if you can't take care of your child, we will take care of your child for you. It's also important to also understand that even at current, the majority of foster care placements and child removals is because of neglect. And that category of neglect is also conflated with poverty. So many people are losing their children simply because they cannot afford to live in one of the world's most wealthy nations, right? So it's important to understand that this out-of-home foster care system that we know it was created because of their hesitation to give Black women welfare benefits that previously existed as in-home services. And so this is a reminder that stories of America are not ahistorical. American institutions are not neutral. They do operate in racialized and even racist ways. And so the disenfranchisement of foster youth of color, particularly those who are Black, make them more vulnerable to being traumatized and criminalized, facing structures like policing and practices and norms that track them out of the college-going practice. And so Gloria Ladson-Billings has an awesome paper called The Education Debt, meaning that there's not an opportunity gap, there's not an achievement gap. There has been a systematic divestment in education. And then so understanding carceral logics, there is a hyper investment in prisons, jails, and also punitive policies. And so an education debt framework argues that academic achievement gap is misplaced. The education debt refers to the systematic, economic, social, political, and moral divestment from public education. And so we see that since 1980, California specifically has built 23 prisons and 1 UC campus, which is UC Merced in 2005, and only 3 CSU campuses, which is San Marcos, Monterey Bay, and Channel Islands. Nationally, America has over 6,600 degree granting institutions and over 7,100 sites of incarceration. We have more spaces to lock up people than we do in America than we do to give them a higher education, right? And so it's really understanding like some of these numbers to understand our hyperinvestment in incarceration and incarceration and our divestment in post-secondary education. And so what happens is foster youth and their pre-college experiences are caught in this carceral nexus. And so Dylan Rodriguez, who was kind of one of my advisors and kind of mentors at UCR, talks about how carceral logics expand beyond the boundaries of prison and the walls that surround it. Notice I'm not saying incarceration, we're talking about carceral logics, the way in which that we think, the way in which that we treat people, the way in which that we think about people. Prison is not just a place, but an arrangement, a way of thinking that is rooted in punishment, not forgiveness or development. Foster care functions as a nexus of carceration as CPS and child welfare agencies surveil, punish, and criminalize and police Black children and their families. They do this through mandated reporting laws. Schools work in tandem with CPS and the police to remove children from their homes. The majority of mandated reports come from schools, not from hospitals, not from the police. They come from schooling sites. And so myself and my colleague, Brianna, who is a PhD candidate at UCLA, we wrote a piece that talks about how schools create a nexus of incarceration around them. And this stemmed from a short kind of research brief that we did with the Black Male Institute at UCLA about 3 years ago. And so what we found was in LA County Public Schools, 28% of their foster youth population was being educated in a juvenile hall. About 1/3 of their foster youth were being educated in juvie. More recently, we just finished data collection for a statewide study in California, where we did surveys and interviews. And so in a California statewide study, we found that 18% of students reported that they had spent time in juvenile hall. Keep in mind that about 1.7 of the US population is currently incarcerated, right? So this number, so while 18% might not seem that high, just think about how much more higher it is, because these young people, there is something that is with foster care that then tracks them into being incarcerated as well. And even that 0.7% might not seem that high, but also understand that while 0.7 of the US population is currently incarcerated, the US incarcerates 20% of the world's population. And so this is a breakdown of the top 10 schools in LA County, public schools, that is. And I want to direct your attention to the far right. Those 3 schools are juvenile halls. And so you see where the majority of foster youth are being educated in LA County public schools. I remember when Brianna pulled this number, I was like, wait, are you really sure about that? 28%, right? So it kind of shows us how these young people in their pre-college experiences are caught in this carceral nexus. And so some of my research talks about this from a qualitative lens, right? So narrative inquiry. And so this is a student that talks about the ways in which the ways in which she experienced violence and abuse in foster care and at her school. This student says, I was in front of all my friends. He, the campus resource officer, handcuffed me in front of all my friends. They put chains on me. I've never been arrested a day in my life, and he knew who I was because I was pretty active on campus. He knew who I was. I would make small talk with him. It's not like I was a complete stranger. I still had to literally reason and bargain with him so he can take the handcuffs off of me, and I was being escorted throughout the school. So yeah, he humiliated me. It was humiliating to be in handcuffs when I didn't even do anything wrong. This student continues to say, once I got into the office, there was already a social worker there. The social worker said that I was going to be leaving with a foster family. It was crazy. Like everything was kind of already set up. They only let me make like 1 or 2 phone calls to try to reach a family member. And then before you knew it, I was with another family within hours. That was incredibly traumatizing. Another problematic thing that happened from this experience is this student was a senior. This was at the beginning of her senior year. And this experience of her entering foster care derailed her opportunity to apply and go to college for about 3 to 4 years, right? Since then, she's been able to graduate from a university, and at that time of the interview, she was applying to law school. But she did say that this single event changed the trajectory of her life moving forward for the next 3 to 4 years. And so this connects to the hypercriminalization and adultification of Black students, specifically girls in schools. Morris has an excellent book on this called Push Out. This speaks to the ways in which anti-Blackness persists in schooling, child welfare, and policing. It's interesting how this campus resource officer had to put this young person in handcuffs when they were just simply responding to a mandatory report of neglect in the home, supposedly. So why is a young person being criminalized for something she has nothing to do with? There was no crime that occurred on campus. Carceral violence maintains a social hierarchy through racial violence. While white foster youth are also victimized, the foster care system functions the way it does because of its origins and roots and anti-Blackness. And so the impact of a carceral nexus, I say this because so much of the research on this population often makes it feel like that the young people are responsible for their lack of educational success, right? We often say about 50% of foster youth graduate from high school, but that's not their fault. They're in this system that is pushing them out of schools and out of a college going process. So I want to make sure that we try to reframe our language and not placing the blame on these young people and really holding these institutions accountable for their lack of care for these young people. So youth who experience foster care have higher rates of mental health issues compared to their college-age peers. 2% of college students had serious suicide ideation compared to foster youth who had a suicide ideation at 26.7%. And then foster youth experienced PTSD at double the rate than youth the same age. And again, this is as a result of the impact of the carceral violence that they are experiencing in their communities and also in foster care. And so what happens when you are entangled in this carceral logic? The way it plays out educationally is foster youth, 60% of them have about 7 or more school changes. As far as high school graduation, as I said, about 50% will graduate from high school. And then this is going back to the study that me and my colleague Brianna did on LA County Public Schools. We also looked at the graduation rates within LA County. LA County is also important because LA County has the highest foster care populated county in the entire country. So many people look at LA County as kind of a model of what to do, what's to come, et cetera. And a lot of people have put a lot of money into LA County to try to fix these problems. And so you see that within LA County, only 51% of Black foster youth are graduating. And then because my research is located within higher education more specifically, we also looked at those who enrolled in college. And then so the blue bar stands for California community colleges, the yellow bar stands for CSU, the Cal State system, and then the orange bar stands for the UC. And so the 2017-2018 graduating cohort in LA County Public Schools, about 31% of the Black foster youth were enrolling in community college, about 6% were enrolling in Cal State, and 0% enrolled in a UC. I remember when Brianna pulled this stat, I was like, wait, no, but I have several Black students in my program at UCR. Then I thought about it, and all of them were community college transfers. There's nothing wrong with the community college, but as we know, a lot of students get lost in the community colleges as they don't have the same systems that are there at a 4-year university type setting. And it often takes them longer to transfer, if they ever do transfer, to a 4-year university. And then so this is stats across the entire state of California. 51% of Black foster youth students will graduate on time. 38% of Black foster youth students are in special education. Black foster youth are 6 times more likely to be suspended from school, and Black foster youth are 2 times as likely to be chronically absent. And so now that I'm at UNLV, I'm also looking at the educational trajectories of foster youth across the state of Nevada. Nevada is interesting because in Las Vegas, we have the 5th largest school district in the nation, which is Clark County School District. And as you'll see, these are some of the high school graduation rates by IEP status and foster care experience. And so to me, what was incredibly disheartening is looking at the Nevada students with an IEP and foster care experience. Only 31, if you want to round up, in 2020, only 32% of them graduated from a Nevada high school. Right, and so it's interesting as we look at some of these very grim numbers, right? All of these compounding low life outcomes and educational outcomes. This is why it is framed as a carceral logic, meaning we're pushing these young people out of their opportunities to graduate from high school and then go to college. And this is by race. So you'll see the gray bar is the general student pop in Nevada. And then the purple bar is all Nevada foster youth students. About 46% of them are graduating from high school. And then you look at Black foster youth in Nevada in 2017, 2018, 39% of them graduated from high school. So incredibly low numbers here in Nevada. And then, so again, going back to the educational outcomes as it relates to college enrollment, less than 10% will enroll in a 4-year degree. And that 3% number that some of us probably know about 3% of foster youth will graduate with a bachelor's degree by age 26. And so going back to understanding that the root of these carceral logics and the impact of them and the way that they play out in educational spaces is because the ways in which that America is rooted in anti-Blackness. And this picture, and this image rather, as I see it on my IG and Twitter feeds every so often, always reminds me that mass incarceration is still currently presently happening. Segregation is not that far long ago either. My foster grandmother was born and raised in Jackson. She was born and raised in the Jim Crow South, right? And so the remnants of those racist policies still play out today. And so I was talking about students and intersecting them with what is it like to be Black in foster in college. And many of them described it as an anomaly, right? So one student described being Black and being foster felt like I didn't always fit in either group. I did eventually become a member of the BSU, but there was always a barrier. The things they complained about were so trivial to me. During the winter and summer breaks, they had family to go home to. I was in the dorms alone. It got depressing. Campus was hella empty. Another student says, I would say being Black and foster and in college is very hard. There's a lot of family aspects I feel like you don't realize you don't have until you get to college. You see, there's assignments on your family history, there's family day, there's people talking about their parents, and you're like, well, I don't have that. But you don't want to really tell people that because they're going to be like, oh, I'm sorry, and pity you and look at you like a charity case. Then being Black, people see you as a threat. So you're kind of dealing with two identities that are oppressed and have negative connotations to them. It's exhausting trying to navigate that in college. And so this speaks to what Crenshaw talks about is the intersections of marginalized identities and how they show up in certain spaces. And so Black foster youth collegians have to navigate racism and what I call foster phobia, the prejudice and marginalization of experiencing foster care. And this influences how they navigated their college campus. And lastly, Black foster youth are also navigating the labor of the Black tax, meaning always having to do more because people already see you as less than, as well as navigating not having family privilege. And so next, we're going to talk about family privilege. And so Sieta is the one that coined this framework, and I find it to be incredibly useful. And so family privilege is the often unnoticed benefits that stem from being a member of a stable family. Other researchers Other researchers are going on to kind of push family privilege framework in more critical ways. Family privilege is steeped in whiteness, classism, and heteronormativity. The performance of family reinforces hegemony and supremacy. And I want to go back to this idea of the performance of family. What does that look like? Every year around the holidays, we get a bunch of cards from family members that we love. Some of them we speak to or haven't spoken to in years, but it's always helpful to kind of keep track of what's going on via photos like these. However, when we talk about the performance of family, this, for a lot of young people who grew up in foster care, they may have never been in a home like this, right? It's very white, it's very heteronormative. I feel like this picture is only missing a dog, right? And so we have to understand that family, in the way in which we define it, is a construct and a performance, just like race. And so what happens within college spaces, students are resisting these hegemonic definitions of family. So this one student said, I stopped defining family as blood related. My mother, my father, they didn't play that role in my life as a mother or father. So those principles kind of go out the window. Sorry, they kind of go out the door. And I learned new principles and ways of defining family. I think family in general is a network of people that unconditionally love me and support me. Yeah, I think it's just a network of people that unconditionally love you. And so this next student says, I have created family. Family is what I make it. I have a lot of folks that I call my auntie. I call multiple people my mother because in essence, I feel like they've each given me a piece of themselves. For me, family is not blood, it's defined by who loves me. So that's how I define family. Now, what's interesting though is in their college spaces, not everyone always acknowledge who they call family. So we have to be very careful when we are supporting young people and we are their allies and co-conspirators in this work, that we honor whom they call family. And so this also highlights the ways in which foster youth are subverting norms and creating chosen family. This also dispels the myth that foster youth don't have family. And then lastly, these chosen familial bonds provided lessons of caring, coping, and providing these lessons are vital, considering the experiences students have gone through. And so that's speaking to this idea of community cultural wealth, which also stems from critical race theory. And so kind of the last thing I want to talk about is the ways in which community acts as a space of resistance towards that violence, and creates a village to support these young people as they're navigating their post-secondary education. And so here, a staff member that I interviewed as part of a research project says, I do whatever I can to support my students, especially my Black foster youth. Our campus isn't diverse. We are in the Deep South, so the neighborhood around campus isn't welcoming. I noticed that I notice, and they, meaning her Black foster youth, often tell me that they feel isolated and alone on campus. So I'm the annoying person that's constantly there, checking in on my students and advocating for their support. I had a student who was experiencing some housing insecurity, so we put him up in a hotel for a couple of weeks to help him get on his feet. Another staff member talks about Weave, the foster youth support program, paid for students' housing fees using program funding as a campus recharge. Technically, you're not supposed to do that, but they're policies, not laws. And I will support my students any way I can. I don't want them to be homeless. And so this is another example of the very intentional ways that these staff members are using their social capital to support these students via their foster youth support program. And so a student talks about how the ways in which they use community as a response and as a resistance towards carceral violence. One student says, I started to think about how much my ancestors had to fight to get into different positions in society. I felt like I was taking us back, like I was taking steps backwards because I was in this domestic position taking care of people. I know it sounds wrong, but take care of white people and me as a Black woman, it just started to feel triggering for me. I got to a point where I didn't want to do that anymore. For me, it wasn't what my ancestors fought for. I wanted a different fight. I wanted more. I needed to go back to school. And then so lastly, in this context of community as resistance, another student says this: I think one thing I am proud of when it comes to being a foster youth is my ability to overcome almost anything. I hate the word, but we are really resilient. We don't get enough credit for it. What happened to me shouldn't really happen to anyone, but it's made me smarter and stronger. I now use my experience to fuel my desire to become a lawyer and try to change these institutions. And so community as resistance is important to understand how these programs created counter spaces when minoritized students have a critical mass. Oftentimes their minoritized identity tends to fade into the background, allowing them to finally have space to explore other parts of themselves. And also, it's really important to also circle back to how these staff members showed up for these students in such critical ways. And many of them were very much aware that their Black foster youth were experiencing campus and their communities in very different ways that their non-Black students were not experiencing. And so as we move forward with my last 5 minutes, where do we go from here, right? So for me and kind of my thinking, and I'm borrowing from Dr. Detlef, who is a professor and former dean at University of Houston, is through abolition frameworks and his upend movement. And so what is abolition? It is reimagining the current frameworks that are not serving the most marginalized. Abolition is not just about changing institutions, it's about changing people's ideas, it's about changing prevailing ideology toward creating systems that are built on creating transformative and justice-centered relationships. Abolition is creating spaces that see the humanness in other people. We need to see each other's vulnerability, love, and care. And so what are we abolishing, right? Policing as it relates to the institution of punitive logics, surveilling, punishing, and domination over children, families, communities, and our bodies. We are abolishing institutions that create and or enable oppression and violence, and institutions that promote rest and equity. There's a really dope blog and kind of a movement called the Nap Ministry that really promotes rest and how the system of capitalism oftentimes harms many of us, especially those who are Black, by overworking us. And also we're abolishing treating people like transactions and numbers, and then systems that require foster youth to be resilient in the first place. I'm currently working on another research project where we met this morning to debrief around some of the interviews that we just wrapped up doing. We interviewed about like 25 foster youth who attended a university in LA County. And we asked them, what are the ways in which your foster care experience prepared you for COVID-19? And many of the students had some of them had an issue with the way we phrased that question, but it was helpful because on one end, they said foster care didn't prepare me at all. But on the other end, what they did say is the isolation I felt during the lockdowns of COVID, not being able to see anyone, feeling like I was trapped in my own home, was very similar to the ways in which I experienced foster care. Then we asked them, how did their foster care experience prepare them for the racial injustice and racial uprisings that also happened during the summer of 2020. Similarly, they said that my foster parents never really sat down and gave me a talk of how to interact with the police. But because I was in foster care for so long, I interacted with the police and experienced police violence. So to me, that was nothing new. And so it's interesting as we are preparing young people for the world through lessons of trauma. So many of the ways that they experienced foster care was through trauma. And that's how they're now relating to the moments now that they're in adulthood. And to me, that is incredibly problematic. And so lastly, I just wanted to say, we have to shift from problem to possibility. Oppression has stifled our ability to dream and think of a world where the most marginalized thrive. We are too comfortable with harm reduction. How do we dream of spaces that are entirely different? Last night, I was teaching class and I asked my students, I gave them a reading by this awesome article by a higher ed scholar named Wilson O'Kello. And in it, he is creating his own framework called self-definition. And one of the kind of tenets of his framework is self-love. And I asked the students, if you were the dean of student life, if you're the dean of a college here at UNLV, how would you integrate self-love into your work, right? Whether it's with students, whether it's with your staff, whether it's with faculty. And many of them had a difficulty thinking outside of the box, thinking outside of this majority way of thinking that has been ingrained in all of us. And many of them struggled with, how do we integrate self-love into our work, right? And so I think it's important for us to shift from problem to possibilities and be very imaginative in how we show up and support these students. And so that's my time, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whitman. Patricia, I'm going to hand it over to you. Did you get any questions in the chat or want to open it up?
Don't have any questions, but for those of you that are participating, if you do, I've got a lot of wows. Thank you. Amazing presentation. The awareness. And I feel like you presented these key terms that I need to highlight now and make sure that in my classes, I'm making more aware for my students to be aware of. So thank you for that. But does anybody out there have any questions that they would like to ask Dr. Whitman? I am going to post in the chat some publications and resources that he has provided for you all. So I'm sending that out now if you want to take advantage of that. They're asking for your slideshow or information, and I believe Dr. Whitman is going to provide a synopsis of the information that he presented today, and so we will be sure to share that with all of you.
Any questions, comments, thoughts?
If I could
Great
just
presentation, very informative.
if I could just make a comment or statement, I guess, and maybe a question too will follow. A lot of things that stuck out to me, Dr. Whitman, so much in your presentation. I really appreciate just the awareness that you're bringing. And one of the areas that really stuck me was at the beginning of your talk. Just a lot of us here have worked in foster care systems, you know, as social workers. And one of the things that really was an aha moment for me was when you talked about being outed, you know, as a foster youth. And you know, depending on where you're placed in what family, you know, in terms of their race. And I know there's been a lot of discussion over the years about ways to increase, you know, opportunities for you know, people of color to be foster parents and to be able to get into, have a buy into the system in terms of being able to, you know, have a foster children that they can identify with in terms of culture. Do you have, you know, perhaps more thoughts on, I guess, ways that foster care systems, because they are bureaucratic, you know, we've worked in them, we know that it's very disheartening at times, but how can we maybe as educators or, you know, as we talk to, you know, different spaces about foster care and advocacy, how could we help to increase, you know, maybe some of that or actually decrease the way in which foster youth are being outed, you know, based on where they're placed?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, the outing typically comes from teachers, right? Because they're the ones that kind of really know, right? And I mean, students are going to, you know, a 13-year-old is going to be a 13-year-old and the way that they kind of sometimes manage like their peer and social relationships. But I just remember I was thankful as I reflect and think about my high school experiences. Whenever I would have a doctor's appointment and have to get pulled out of class early, you know, they always reference that was my grandmother, right? And so there was a community of care there at Florence High School in Sacramento, where they in many ways protected me, right? And not outing me. I'm not sure if it was a training they got or just kind of how they got down and kind of, they were just amazing people. But there is definitely a level of community and care that sadly isn't the norm when we think about secondary education, right? When we talk about foster youth attending schools.
I have a question. You talked a little bit about like the campus support programs and creating a community of care, but you also have been a practitioner. So can you share some of the practices you utilized in developing the racial identity of some of the young people you worked with beyond just
Yeah.
foster care identity?
Yeah, a lot of, I'll just say like in developing some of these kind of like programs and activities and events, I got a lot of pushback, right? Oh no, that is the Center for the Black Center Resource Office, or that's for that office to do. But one thing I realized very quickly is many of the students trusted me, because in many ways the foster care experiences is what gave them some shame and stigma. And so they felt most comfortable around me and our program. And so some of the activities that we're eventually able to get to were, some identity centered workshops. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with the identity wheel, right? I taught and led a kind of a first year seminar course through my program. And also we had another course kind of prepping juniors and seniors for life after graduation. And those both 1-unit classes that I taught, they were unit bearing courses. We also wove in conversations throughout every week and every reading around identity. Even in my practice now as a faculty member, this semester I'm teaching college student development theory. You can't teach student development theory without talking about identity, right? So while we talk about, Erickson, and we talk about Jung and some of these other more foundational theoretical frameworks around adult development, we're also talking about other frameworks that get at gender identity development and racial identity development. And we also had fun at UCR when exploring the identities that we hold. So maybe it's going to see a play at the Fox Theater in downtown Riverside. Maybe it's going to LA and going to the LACMA Museum because there's a really dope art exhibit and installation that's talking about the Black Panther movement, right? So it wasn't always in this didactic academic sense. One of the kind of events and kind of programs that I created was this performing and visual arts event that we did for Foster Youth Awareness Month, or Foster Care Awareness Month, called Voices and Visions. So I would work with the students, those who wanted to participate, to work on a couple of pieces of spoken word poetry that they would then perform at the event if they wanted to. Then another group of students, if they wanted to, we would work in helping them create kind of more of a visual art installation. And through those creative and art activities, oftentimes it is exploring the self that you have to get at. It is exploring your identities and your experiences if you're creating visual or performance art. So it wasn't always in this stuffy kind of academic room that we explored identity. It was also through kind of fun. It was through art. It was through poetry. It was through various means.
Thanks.
Any other questions out there?
I have a quick question. Thank you, Dr. Whitman, for your presentation. Has there been any changes since there has been more funding towards the high schools for foster youth and homeless youth, and funding for colleges for foster youth? Have you seen any kind of changes to students' retention rates and going to college now?
I mean, yes and no. We're seeing more opportunities and access for young people who are in foster care to enter college, whether that's via community college route or the Cal State or the UC. But what we lack incredibly in pretty much every state in the country is data to track them, right? So like I said, we did this statewide study. And also there's the other side where my research background is I'm always interviewing both perspectives, students and staff. So we also surveyed staff members at all of the 23 Cal State campuses. We surveyed them, interviewed them, and only a couple of campuses had access to IR data, right? And this is at an institution of higher learning that is about producing research, right? And so I can't imagine what that looks like in a foster care agency or county office somewhere, right? And their inability to track these numbers. And so while we're seeing more programs, we don't really have the institutional, statewide, and even nationwide data to understand how these interventions are improving their lives. But I also want to say, and this is something that Dr. Lopez and I talk about often, is though we can't replace people with policy, right? So just because we throw money behind something and create a program, create a policy, we still need people to care about these young people, because that's what it is, isn't it? We're taking these kids away from their families and saying that the government essentially could do a better job at raising you. So we still need people, even in light of policy change, to support them.
Thank you.
Amazing, Dr. Whitman. We have just a couple more minutes before we close out. Are there any other questions out there?
Or even comments. I would be interested in comments too.
I want to say thank you for having me. It was great being able to present some of my work. I'm really passionate about it. For those of you who want to contact me via email, please feel free. Yes, and happy Black History Month.
We
It's
have
like Dr. Herms has, yeah.
Yeah, we have one question from Dr. Herms.
Yeah, Dr. Whitman, thank you so much for the presentation and for sharing with us such rich material. I'm thinking a little bit broader than only the foster youth topic that you've shared with us, but I'd like to bring that back home to my question. Before the Supreme Court right now in the United States is a move to eliminate what has been called by some as affirmative action policies. And you've talked about just the realities of intersectionality, this kind of unwitting privilege that is associated even simply with normative family patterns. And I wonder if we're faced, as we likely are, with the removal of something like affirmative action, can you think of some strategies that you and your colleagues perhaps are already thinking of? What are ways that we can elevate the profile of marginalized students when, you know, sad to say, even some of that kind of federal incentive will be taken away?
Yeah, so yeah, I remember me and my advisor, because she does work on affirmative action, and Dr. Uma Jaya Kumar, she's a brilliant scholar. She was one of the kind of like experts that they went to prepare the amicus brief for the UNC Chapel Hill case. And so similarly, the ways in which whiteness moves and morphs to maintain this kind of structure that we all live in, you know, called whiteness and racism, we too have to be just as smart and like moving and shifting to still try our best to support marginalized people. To be honest, I don't really have an answer for your question. It's something that we know is going to set us back decades. It already has in California, right, with the ban of affirmative action. And we know in other states that are not as progressive as California. I say the word progressive loosely and with caution in describing parts of California. But in other states, like the Carolinas, is going to set them back tremendously, right? But we do have to be creative and still creating support for people who identify as Black and are Latinx. But yeah, I mean, thank you for highlighting that. I mean, it's going to be, you know, I think we could all assume how the court is going to weigh in on that case. And yeah, I mean, there's other people who study that are much more smarter than I that probably have an answer to that question.
Yeah, I appreciate the response. I certainly don't have an answer either, except that it seems like naming it, being aware of it, and then doing what we can to resist and push in the other direction. And that may mean, you know, a variety of different creative options depending on context, but I appreciate the response. Thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Whitman. We appreciate you joining us today. This has just been rich. You and I literally talk about this for hours, so we could go on and on. But for those of you who attended, if you can please just take a brief moment. We have a link for a survey. If you can take a few minutes to fill that out, we would greatly appreciate it. And just thank you again. This will be recorded and shared at a later date. Thank you so much.